We are thinking more like some of the Web2 teams and not Web3 teams, where we avoid a lot of talk around like alignment, around higher level philosophical ideas, and try to be very focused on the engineering side, very focused on like how we think like what we're building will make blockchain space more usable, more user friendly, and actually can enable new generation of products.
Hello, and welcome to Public Key. This is your host, Ian Andrews. The most common critique I hear people throw at blockchain is, it doesn't scale. That comment is almost always followed by a number of transactions processed per day by one of the big credit card networks. Personally, I've always found that to be an oversimplified critique, as if transactions per second is the only measure of a network's worth. But the core of the argument actually is valid. If a transaction on a blockchain takes longer and costs more to process than on traditional infrastructure, well, it's not likely to migrate to a blockchain. Of course, there are a lot of people working on blockchain scalability, from the core Ethereum dev teams to a seemingly unlimited number of layer 2 networks and app chains. There's some fascinating ideas about how to maintain security and decentralization, but to also provide low-cost, high-throughput transaction execution. In this episode, I speak with Layer N, who are one of the new and exciting companies building in this area. Dima Romanov is co-founder and CEO, and his team at Layer N are building something they call Ethereum's StateNet. In our conversation, Dima shares insights on tackling blockchain scalability, lowering transaction fees, and improving on one virtual machine to rule them all approach that he says enables a diverse application runtime. He explains why thinking more like a Web 2 company instead of a Web 3 company has attracted investors and given their team a competitive edge for developers seeking performance and innovation as they prepare for their DeFi-focused upcoming mainnet launch. Last thing before we jump in, my team has just released the Chainalysis money laundering report. It turns out that crypto has caught the attention of traditional fiat money launderers. The full report includes methods for tracing and identifying money laundering networks. Head down to the show notes to find a link to download the full report today. Today I'm joined by Dima Romanov, who is co-founder and CEO at Layer N. Dima, welcome to the show.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you for introduction, Ian.
Dima, we're going to get into a wide range of topics today. You're pretty active on Twitter, so anybody out there that is still on that platform, I guess we have to call it X now. You're at Dima_null. Not afraid to air your opinions, but I think most of what we want to talk about today is actually your company Layer N, because I think you're creating some really interesting technology. But maybe before we get to that topic, share a little bit about your background. How do you find yourself as CEO of a layer 2 blockchain company?
Yeah, totally. I think like my crypto journey starts a couple of years ago in 21, where I and literally friends like who I knew since high school, so we go like way back years, like built a ton of things together, decided like to venture into crypto, and was like our backgrounds, crypto felt like an industry which moves so quickly and so rapidly that damn, like it's like inexcusable to not try to build something, right? Like the problem at large seemed like so big, and the opportunity was so big, like to essentially create a strong impact in the world of like reinventing financial systems. And I think like we also saw the appeal of Solana at the time, right? Like we heard like a lot of the claims like Solana gonna build the future of NASDAQ. It's going to be the future of financial systems. And it also like at hindsight, like made a lot of sense. And then as well as like, we were like, hey, we want to build products for everyone. Like, so when we tried Ethereum, it's like, okay, we got to wait like 15 minutes for our transactions finalized, got to pay $200 to buy a meme coin or whatnot, whatever was happening in early 21. So that part didn't make sense. So we tried out Solana. We decided to build a company there first. We decided to start with an exchange as well. We were like, hey, like this NASDAQ vision like makes a lot of sense to us. It's like opportunity is so big. In hindsight, it feels like we were a bit naive in a way, like when we started off. And then like we realized a lot of like problems with existing blockchains as we started to try to scale more and more. Specifically after we launched, like which was like 22, we saw that hey, like Solana is like premise around NASDAQ is like great, but in practice, NASDAQ does 200,000 transactions a second. And that's like 2 magnitudes more than all of the blockchains did at the time combined. And then you're like trying to figure out different solutions, like how we can work around this problem. What can we do on engineering side? And then you start to struggle with Solana congestions, and you struggle with latency. And at the end, by like the time it was like May 22, we realized like, hold on a second, like this is not working. No matter what we're doing here, like there's just like this walls like we cannot overcome because of an underlying infrastructure layer. And our first thought was like, let's talk to other infrastructure layers. Like maybe there are people who are thinking about it, who are solving this problem. So we go around talking to L2s, L1s before they even like some of them even go live, and realize more and more is that it feels like most of the blockchain solutions are actually trying to build the solution in a search of a problem instead of being like, hey, here's a stack, like it's going to be used tomorrow for this specific problem. We know this is like the issues that all of the users are struggling with, so we're going to solve it. And because of that, we decided like, hey, let's reinvent a bit like how infrastructure works. And that's how we came to an idea of layer N and Ethereum, which the rollup, which can actually scale, which can actually solve all the problems that we face as developers, that we heard from other people facing, and actually open up the space for innovation, open up the space for new opportunities to build in crypto. And we essentially finalized our vision, finalized our like initial drafts of architecture around March last year, raised our first round back in the summer 23. And since then, been scaling the team. I think like we're almost 20 people now. And I think like layer N is probably the most exciting thing in the blockchain today, from our point of view, at least.
Yeah, it's been, I think, a wild ride for you from maybe the lows of 22 to the highs last year of raising from Founders Fund, right? Peter Thiel's venture capital firm. Talk to me a little bit about how you got Founders Fund interested in Layer N. I'm curious what compelled them to invest. They had been in crypto in the last cycle and then had seemingly left the space pretty much entirely. So you're a bit of an outlier here. I'm really curious how you approach fundraising in general and then specifically with them.
Yeah, I mean, we started our raise in June 23, and our anticipation, it's going to be tough. Like, we probably not going to manage to raise much money given the environment that we are in. We know that everyone scaled down, that we know everyone took a step back, and we were actually surprised. I think, like, in the end, like, our thinking around product, around like how we approach things, like differentiated a lot from most crypto teams, right? We had like this clear problems in mind that we wanted to solve. We had a clear product in mind which we thought like would address it, right? And I think it resonated with a lot of people. And I think in case of Founders Fund, it might have also struck the chord where it's like we are thinking more like some of the Web2 teams and not Web3 teams, where we avoid a lot of talk around like alignment, around like higher level philosophical ideas, and try to be very focused on the engineering side, very focused on like how we think like what we're building will make blockchain space more usable, more user friendly, and actually can enable new generation of products. And I think that like allowed us like to get a ton of useful investors, a ton of helpful folks like from all over the place. Like we got people who have TradFi background, who are very crypto native, who are market makers, exchanges, and Founders Fund as well. So we got like a really strong backing, making sure that like we have the support in every corner of crypto essentially. But overall, like all of this like came to be because like of how our mindset was like so oriented on problem solving, and our experience as well like allowed us like to see like how exactly we can solve these problems long term, and how we can shape our network in such a way that it can scale to new use cases and bring in more users on board.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the problems you identified. You've touched on scale a little bit, and just kind of one measure of scale obviously is transaction throughput, but talk about some of the other problems that you identified in that journey over the last 2.5 years that led you to Layer N.
Essentially, I think crypto, or like any industry as a whole, like over short term, midterm, can deviate from like the correct course. Like we can have Luna sometimes, we can have FTXs of the things, like pulling the industry in different directions, especially when it's so financialized. Like you realize that there's people walking in very different directions very quickly, because like then incentives like kind of get screwed up. And what we observed in crypto is that people more and more embrace like more of a horizontal scaling, starting to realize that we cannot build everything on a single chain. Like we can even make it like super performant, but it's not going to be enough. Right? We see even Solana is struggling with the demand for just like trading meme coins, right? It's like not enough like to handle that. Now think about if the goal is to put Binance there, and Binance is handling 700,000 transactions a second, has like millions of users, like how is it even possible? Sure, we can continue scaling, but at some point we reach an upper limit when we try to put everything on a single application. Google is not running on a single server. Even like a financial applications like rarely do so. So obviously we see this horizontal scaling. we also see people starting to embrace more and more rollups, like alternative DA layers, and realizing we need higher throughput. I think like Solana, what it does, it also justifies that, yeah, people cannot sustainably pay $50 per transactions. People cannot use a network if it's 15 TPS. So overall, like what we saw is just like requirement for like horizontal scaling, requirement for low transaction cost, and we're requiring for high transaction cost. And another factor is that as applications try to improve their products, they resort to custom inference. They're no longer using the same EVM chain to build everything. They start to build custom stacks. And when we think about the most successful applications over the past few years, all of them like took some stack and tried to modify it, make it better. Right, like take a look at Hyperliquid today, DYDX, Avo, Farcaster, and a bunch of other examples like who all opted in for the chain, and a lot of them not even opted in for the chain because like some being sovereign and whatnot, but because like that's how they can provide the best user experience, right? That's how they can build a product which can satisfy that. But the challenge was there is that like whenever you build a custom chain, you lose all the composability angle. You can no longer compose with everyone, which was like the main factor of like success for Ethereum and Solana and all the other chains, that you have one shared. And so seeing all of this like ideas and progress, like we thought like, hey, how can we make blockchains work in such a way that you still have a shared liquidity layer, you have composability across like potentially thousands of applications, but you still can scale them horizontally and in a custom way such that like each application can be run on a separate server so that it doesn't share compute and bandwidth with everyone else, and how we can increase throughput. So all of this culminated in the vision for layer N, and how we see layer N is like a network of rollups where each individual rollup can build their own infrastructures, they optimize for their own performance, capture their resources like of an entire server node instead of like sharing it with dozens of other applications, and at the same time can pass messages to each other like seamlessly.
The concept is really compelling, right? Low fees, high transaction throughput, flexibility of kind of implementation that becomes app or domain specific so that we don't have kind of a collision of resources between competing applications, and also a universal liquidity or access layer. Because I imagine in the future, not all these applications are financial in nature, but this avoidance of needing like complex bridge layers or third-party tools to kind of move your data and information, which may be financial or may not, between them. That all makes a lot of sense to me. It seems like there's a lot of people going after this same problem. Like the problem set is fairly well known. The one that came to mind as you were talking was Cosmos chain, where I think they're very into this notion of app-specific chains. Like compare and contrast, if you can, at a high level first, before we really dive into the depths of what layer N is built. How should people think about you versus the other layer 2s that are out there, and especially something like Cosmos, who's kind of going after this app-specific chain concept?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like Cosmos and aggregation layer probably is the closest competitors to us and the closest comparisons, right? And we spend a lot of time like figuring out the best design and the best approach to that, and how can we create like the best environment for developers. Because at the end of the day, like our thoughts process that the winner of this space, or like the biggest player of the space, will be the one who will provide the best experience for developers and users, right? Who will gain the most adoption, whose stack will succeed in that the most. And when we look at Cosmos, like we see a lot of friction points, right? For developers, like when you use IBC, you deal with delays. It's not instant communication. It's not sub 1 second. So this friction limits this communication aspect. And another one is performance, right? It's not enough to just like, connect everything. Each individual chain needs to have like high performance capabilities, right? And Cosmos is like severely limiting that, right? Like if you need to run nodes for your chain, like your latency goes down, and it becomes like a lot harder for you to get adoption because you need to deal with that. And sometimes it also like limits the security of your chain because you need to put up your own validator set. You need to figure out like the economic incentive there. And in the end, like it's inferior to Ethereum rollup structure if you do have fraud proofs, if you do have all the required components of an Ethereum side to guarantee that people can exit safely. So that's a comparison to Cosmos. When it comes like to aggregation layer, we specifically opted in for a zero knowledge fraud proofs instead of going like 100% zero knowledge, is because we care about a user experience, like I mentioned earlier, is that, and And zero knowledge like has its limits. It's like progressing very quickly, right? And teams like ReZero, Succinct are like rapidly improving the space to make it faster, and Polygon as well. But it's still not enough to run like enterprise scale applications who serve like millions of people or hundreds of thousands of users. And for that matter, like we decided to let's focus first on performance. Let's focus first on new use cases, because before making them production ready and ready for proving real time, right? We don't want to be spending like tens of millions of dollars a year just on proving costs. It's gotta make our livelihood pretty difficult, or we're gonna have to offset all of this fees to users, which is not ideal either. So because of that, like we have an edge in performance over the Polygon approach and aggregation layer side, as well as like we believe our messaging design makes it a lot simpler for people to build applications. And this is more nitty gritty, but I think like the question is like how quickly can people build cross-chain applications within our ecosystem versus Cosmos versus aggregation layer. And we target like that specific use case for a lot of this, because our goal is to create this like flywheel of an ecosystem where each individual chain not just brings more users on board, but creates like more flow of assets, activity, data between all those chains to build better ecosystem.
Super helpful explanation. I guess the other thing that's on my mind is Ethereum itself is not a static ecosystem. So there's a pretty ambitious roadmap that's been laid out for where Ethereum goes, and I think it's also aiming at solving some similar problems to what you're going after. What's your perspective on the state of Ethereum at this point? Is it has it been successful? And if they ultimately kind of pull off the multi-year roadmap that they're building toward, does that remove some of the need and demand for what Layer N's creating?
I think what's nice about Ethereum ecosystem is that at this point, it feels like it's no longer like one team marching forward. Here's like one way of doing it, right? Eigenlayer was never part of Ethereum roadmap, right? The data availability in the shape or form that it is today on EigenDA side, like has never been a part of like Ethereum roadmap. And for sure, like we can take a look at Ethereum roadmap, which I think like given their focus, like might take a long time to implement, execute, and a huge question mark is like what it will look like in the end, right? Vitalik also changes his opinions over time, like on a lot of things as system shapes. Like, so our general view is that like we no longer see it as like, hey, like there's like one like team building Ethereum. It's more like people trying different things, and what we care the most is what we can do today to bring users in, what we can do today to build new applications, and obviously pay attention to all of the developments. And I think building on Ethereum has been a decision more so on the fact that Ethereum, like researchers and team approach all of their developments with a focus on stability, making sure that every update is stable, that there's no crazy updates that like break the system, break rollups, whatnot. And so that allows like people building on top of them to be very confident that like everything's going to be all right in a year or so. And for a team like ours, like, hey, we can focus and experiment our layer, knowing that the underlying infrastructure will continue to exist. And we don't particularly see that like in a year or two or five, like Ethereum will approach the same performance as us, given like how we are architecting our system. But what matters to us is that like, hey, there's a lot of lessons to learn from there, as well as like we can be confident that like they'll continue to push out any updates with a sense of like security in mind that allows us like to experiment a lot more ourselves.
It's great. Let's dive into the technology a little bit. When I go to the website, the headline is Layer N is an Ethereum state net. And I'm going to just take a wild guess because my personal reaction was, I'm not sure what that means. That most of our audience maybe is also wondering, well, what's a state net and why do I need it? So maybe you can start there and lead us into why is that the description? What's underlying that? And what does this really start to solve for users of the blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with Stata is just like a name that you could try to come up to describe architecture to use like some kind of like label to what we're doing, right? Like the same way how Layer N is a name of like the network, whatnot. But in reality, I think like you want to shift like the perception that rollups should be just like one application, one server node, and move towards the concept that, hey, it should be a network of things. It should not be this like, we should not be building towards like, hey, there's going to be L2, this L2 will have L3s, and this L3s will have L4s, right? This feels like a very bumpy road ahead for anyone trying to use this entire system. And how we see it is that like Layer N is not just like a rollup, it's a network of rollups. It's a net state like spread out across like a network of things. And the nice part about it is that like, hey, you join layer N, like you use one chain, here's like a dozen other applications running on their separate chains, right? And we're also not targeting, hey, like we want to have like a dozen EVMs, like, right? Ideally, we only have like one, maximum two EVMs in total. And the goal is like to essentially for people to come in and build new apps completely from a different stack, et cetera, et cetera. So you create this network of highly scalable applications which unlock new use cases. As a user, like my sales pitch is that like, hey, come join this ecosystem because you will not see the same problems you see with other chains. You will see newer products which can leverage infrastructure a lot better than anyone else. You will see new things, a lot more performant, and you will not have to deal with all this withdrawal periods like on every other single chain. And that's like where the progress will be for the next few years.
That's cool. So in the architecture, you talk about a couple components that were new to me, and one is this idea of something called an XVM. Can you explain what that does and how I might use it if I were a developer building on top of layer N?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like our question is like how we can make our framework for people to build as versatile as possible. XVM is essentially a framework to build your own VM. And we want to make it as simple as, building a website or launching a smart contract, but as a chain. The advantage there though is that like if you're using XVM, like you have a lot more resources, you have a lot more flexibility. Because I remember building on Solana, like you have to think about compute units. On Ethereum, you have to think about gas optimizations. You have to think about fee market and all of this concept, which are very distracting if your goal is to build the best product. And so that's like the idea of XVM, like how we can live these restrictions. And what it does, like essentially, it's an WASM environment. So ideally, by the end of this year, like anyone can come in and build their smart contracts in C++, Rust, Solidity, as well as like Python even. And multiple other languages which compile to WASM. So the end goal there is that like, hey, we want to enable every language that we know that you can leverage to build a smart contract for your chain and leverage as many resources as you need for it to scale, for it to work permissionlessly. And that's essentially is the best place for people to take whatever smart contract they had, whatever ideas they had to the next level. And that's the end goal. Move beyond like, OP stack and make it simpler, make it easier, make it more direct so people don't need to jump through the hoops and spend hours and hours on things that don't actually make their product better.
One of the things that I've always thought was interesting about the EVM architecture, the Ethereum virtual machine, is that it enables us to run tens of thousands of nodes globally in a fairly protected and secure environment, even though none of the hardware is in and of itself particularly trustworthy, or nor the operators. And it does that by constraining pretty tightly the things that can run inside of that EVM, like relative to a general purpose virtual machine where I have a full operating system and complete programmability. Now I can still do lots of things inside the EVM, but it doesn't really give me like a useful attack surface to disrupt the whole blockchain network, for example. And I get the sense reading about your XVMs that they're more flexible, and you just rattled off one way is you've got more languages that you can support. Are they also sort of general purpose computing environments? Like, can I take any code and run it inside of an XVM, or is there a limitation on that capability?
Obviously, it's not going to be like, everything. Like you cannot run a supercomputer there. There are some limitations. I would just like say that they're like a lot more similar to running like a regular AWS server limitations type of things. There are some things like restricting memory, but overall, it's like a lot simpler than building a smart contract, which should enable like a lot more things. And I think like so far, like what we've been doing is like taking, hey, we're running EVM, which was like built specifically for a distributed system usage to make sure that every node can leverage it. So now let's run it on a centralized server. And my immediate question is like, we are running rollup on a centralized server for like advantages of that, right? Like, so why are we reusing EVM? Why are we not thinking bigger? Why are we not trying to do more things, right? And the end goal is to just like make sure that whatever you're building is easily verifiable by every other person. So like you will be able to run on your computer verification code to essentially make sure that nodes are operating in a valid way, but at the same time, you don't need to worry about making sure that like there's a consensus mechanism in place, that every XVM has like 1,000 nodes like in sync. They just need to replace the state, right? And that makes the development a lot easier, unlocks a lot more new possibilities in terms of what can be built. And I think like it's been a long time coming in this space, and it's surprising that we've primarily had like only EVM rollups so far.
And I guess this leads to my second question, which is when I deploy a smart contract that gets replicated across every node on the network, there's not a similar replication strategy here with an XVM, right? I deploy one, or maybe if I need a few nodes for availability. Is that the right way to think about it? It's much
Yeah.
more like a Web 2 style application runtime.
Yeah, it's a lot more Web 2 style. Obviously, if you're not counting like on a single server, there's like a lot more happening on the backend side in terms of replication of messages, making sure that logs persist. Like we just saw it's like how recently Google Cloud just like accidentally destroyed like a huge amount of data for some financial institutions holding 82 billion of dollars, right? Like we don't want to be in the same space. I
Yeah.
guess like there's like one also nice aspect of building in blockchain is that all the data ends up being distributed because of DA layers.
Yeah.
But that's like we're not just thinking along these lines, but also like thinking about like long-term viability, how we can make processes a lot better. And I think like on a roll-up side, it's like the progress been pretty slow in our opinion, right? Like given that a lot of the problems that which rollups are facing are more Web 2 related, and people have figured out how to solve them, right?
Yeah.
Why do we still have like a lot of these like issues, right? And a lot of these techniques like we are leveraging on our side as well, and we have like incredibly talented engineer with like 20 plus years of experience each. So definitely the goal is like to build an incredibly robust system.
There's another part of the architecture called GVMs, or generalized VM environments. Talk to me about what that ends up getting used for. Is that facilitating kind of the network operations, and maybe it plays into the data availability layer that you referenced a few times, or is it doing something else?
Yeah, so the goal of GVM, I would say the GVM is like more of like a subset of EVM or of XVM, but GVM is like we're referring to EVM, SVM as more of like GVM environment, generalist virtual machine, where we think like people can, it's not just one application running there, it's like where people can launch smart contracts. We realize like we don't want to be very dogmatic and say like every person in layer N ecosystem go build like an XVM, right? For some use cases, you don't need that much customizability, right? Like sometimes you just need a simple smart contract, right? So go launch it on EVM essentially. And so we want to bring in like more environments like this. For now, it's just EVM, but maybe down the line it's going to be SVM as well, VM as well. We'll see how like everything evolves, but that's like essentially the purpose of GVM, a more simpler environment for like potentially a lot simpler applications to be building on top of layer N.
Got it. If I have a simple, say, smart contract, I might deploy that on a GVM. Whereas if I had something like a DEX or an on-chain order book, that would probably go into an XVM.
Exactly. I think like another thing is that like we also see it as potentially, transition, right? Like there's a protocol who's building a lending rollup, right? Like they launch initially on EVM, like it can be Aave fork or Compound fork or like some custom implementation. And at some point, like you realize like, hold on a second, like all of this like lending applications are not that great when you think about it in terms of like what can we do more if you have more compute, and then like they move their application to XVM, essentially unlocking a ton of new use cases, making their app like better. Essentially a way to scale for apps like without having to launch their own Cosmos chain or build their own rollup from scratch, and without losing access to their users and telling them, hey, can you bridge your assets? Please do. And then you lose like access to every other application in the system.
Okay. And the final piece is the inter VM communication protocol, or the IVC, which I suspect is maybe the secret sauce in tying all this together, because it's really what seems to enable high throughput but consistent data availability. Talk about what you're doing in that layer.
Essentially, the goal is like once all of this application is deployed, they can pass messages instantly, sub 1 second, essentially delivery time. And that's like essentially, like you said, like a secret sauce where we believe like it's not enough to just build performant apps. Like performant apps in crypto to be better than Web 2 apps need to access to everything else in the ecosystem. And that ability to pass messages instantly is what makes like layer N a better platform for everyone to build, is what differentiates us, like what makes us a lot more appealing for people, teams to come in and build. And as a way we are also engineering our system is that we are enabling potentially even thousands of rollups, like or thousands of applications to launch as separate XVMs while still being able to communicate with each other. And another nice part is that the way it's architected, even like when we need to, settle on chain, the system doesn't need to pause, right? The system can keep on pushing blocks and it can gradually update each single XVM or rollup node to a new block. So that's like another one nice aspect of layer N. But there's like a ton of ways like how this can be leveraged, right? Like if we start with DEXs and you think like, hey, next stage is market making rollups, and it's structured products on top of exchanges, and it's AI trading agents, and a ton of other use cases. And then like even you build a gaming application which can directly leverage DEX for payments or conversion, whatnot. And I think like that's like what excites us the most.
Yeah. And so right now, all of that is you're in private beta, right? If I want to sign up, I need to track you down on Twitter and get into your DMs, right?
Yeah, I mean,
But
we do have. Oh, yeah, go on.
well, I was going to say, let's play that forward a little bit and assume that you're going to open this up more broadly in the near future. As a developer, where do I start?
I mean, right now, like you mentioned, it's more of like we're working closer with like a lot of teams, like a ton of talented people, like who's been in Shadowware for 20 years or got PhDs or like been a crypto degens, whatnot. But we do want to open the doors to everyone to work permissionlessly. Not that we don't want to help, but we want to make it easy to work without talking to me or without talking to anyone on our team if you don't like us. I don't know. But the goal is essentially to arrive at that point by the end of the year, so that like you can essentially open layer on a website. Here's like the tutorial of how to build XVM. Here's a place where you deploy it. Here's the code that you need to run, etc. But for now, it's more of like a partnership basis where we have a lot of teams working with us, like on the novel ideas. And I guess like at this stage, what's nice is that like it helps us like shape how exactly the final framework will look like, how exactly the dev tooling will look like in the end stage, right? So we can adjust and iterate and help us. But at this time, if you're interested in building something, feel free to shoot me a DM or layer in a DM or like one of my co-founders or people on the team. Everyone is super eager to help, and we are also like scaling a lot and adding more people to the team so we can actually accommodate that and ship a ton of new products this year, which hopefully will like bring us to the next evolution of crypto.
Yeah, and that's where I really wanted to go is so I'm a developer and I've got some great idea and I'm kind of frustrated by scalability and throughput and fee expense on, my favorite L1. And so I say, all right, I'm going to give this layer N thing a try. Like as a developer, what am I doing as step one after I've gotten in touch and gotten access?
Yeah, essentially, like we would hop on a call. We both can help on a product side. Even we have like a ton of folks like who have like a lot of experience both in chat and crypto to ideate, finalize it, and then be, hey, here's like some code base you can build on top of it, and we can figure out like more like tiny details, like or we can adjust it to make sure that everything is compatible. But it's more of like like we let developers build by themselves, but also like help them guide and also adjust like our internal infrastructure. And so that's I guess what's nice like to be building today with us is because like you actually like work with us like directly and have like this opportunity like to tell people like, hey, I don't like this like infrastructure layer. It's not like how you can change like anything on Solana or Ethereum and be like, I really don't like this op code. Like, can you change it tomorrow? Like, no, good luck. So that's like the nice part. And another like a nice aspect is like just how involved you are with schemes, because that's what we care the most about, like the applications that got launched, the new use cases that get unlocked, and how we can enable like the next big idea to essentially succeed in crypto.
Yeah, I'm curious, like at a technical level, like what would I have to change if I had been building on Ethereum for the last few years, and I'm like, you know what? I'm done with the gas situation. I'm done with the throughput challenges. Now I want to build on layer N. Help me understand what it takes to migrate my smart contract based infrastructure onto an XVM.
Yeah, for now, like we are exploring how like to essentially easily port over like smart contracts from Solidity to directly to an XVM. But I think like there's like two optionalities, right? You can take your smart contract, deploy it on EVM, which is going to launch like end of summer, or like you can figure out like how you can build something new. And I'm sure like as a developer, you probably not only work with Solidity, but probably some other languages which we can be enabled and we can work together on that as well. And that's like another optionality, right? So for now, it's like an experimentation stage of how you could potentially port over your existing smart contract into individual XVM, right? I think like there's a ton of interesting things that can be done, right? Like if you want to enable meme coin trading, you can actually just like create a XVM was just Uniswap L2 and enable like GPU acceleration for that because it's like so easily parallelizable, right?
So that's interesting. So step one, I'm probably not going to reuse my Solidity code. It sounds like you're ultimately going to build a compatibility layer. But ideally, if I want to get, significant advantages, I'm probably rewriting in Rust, or maybe as you onboard other languages via your WebAssembly compatibility layer. I've got some choices there. So now let's say I also happen to be a Rust developer in addition to Solidity. I'm multilingual. And so I go ahead and rewrite my app into Solidity and I'm ready to deploy. What then?
Yeah, I think like as soon as ready to deploy, like we have a few launches slated already for June, July, depending on auditing. So our mainnet coming along like very soon. And essentially, like if you're building with us, like you can be even launching end of summer, right? If everything works out great, that's like something that's like on the horizon. And we are also like trying to move as quickly as possible. Obviously not at expense of security, but more of like trying to ship as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I saw you guys had an announcement, I think recently, where a liquidity provider has committed a fairly large dollar amount to the ecosystem, I imagine, to support, and encourage projects to onboard as quickly as possible, right?
Yeah, I think like I mentioned when we were raising a lot of the stuff that we were talking resonated with a lot of people, right? Like
Yeah.
they use like on Ember side they been market making dexes working with teams for years now, right? They know all too well all the issues, like all the problems that they have encountered before, and they're very eager to build or work somewhere where like they don't have to struggle with these issues, right? You would much rather work with teams who are building on a better infrastructure stack. And I think like that's why like we had Amber announcement, we have a couple of other announcements coming along and getting a lot of support from not just like investors who are not using protocols usually, but actually for people who are working with teams or actually working with projects or regular users. Like, and that's like what I think like excites us the most is that like on the product side, like we see a lot of confirmation that's like what we're building makes sense. What we're building is needed and it's going to be used. And it's not just, 5 users on the chain who are moving assets back and forth.
Yeah, you're pretty outspoken, as I said at the top of the podcast on Twitter, about the state, I think, of crypto right now is we have a lot of smart people working on infrastructure, but they're often, it seems, building with no users in sight. And I'm curious how you're managing around that with your own project. Like, what is the strategy to actually build toward and ultimately for a large amount of utility and real users?
Yeah, our question has been always like we don't want to build something and like that's not going to be used. That's just going to exist as a network, and we've been constantly focusing and figuring out how we can actually get traction, how we can actually get real people. And it feels like in blockchain we got very complacent and oftentimes rely on cycles and justifies that issues with our product is because it's bear market or it's bull market. And we are trying to build beyond that and trying to figure out like how whatever we are doing is like gonna survive like all cycles and can move forward to its direction of like more users coming along or more adoption and how we can solve real problems. And I do get like I guess like maybe too outspoken sometimes on Twitter on that topic, but it is like what bothers us the most because like we have come like to the space with huge ambitions and with an idea of like, hey, we want to build something that's like changes the world for the better. Is that we are not here to just like see only meme coins. Not that I'm against them, but we want to see more. We want to see more products, more projects, and we do believe that what we're doing can drive that change. And we're really eager to see it in production on mainnet and getting real users trying it out.
Don't ever slow down on Twitter. The outspoken is why I'm there. So I'm curious if you can share any details. The projects you mentioned that are going to launch later this summer, even if you can't name them specifically, maybe give us a flavor for the types of things that you expect to work really well and layer in.
Yeah, I think made a strategic decision to first focus on DeFi because we thought like every ecosystem initially starts with some financial activity, right? Even when you think about social fi, there's fi in the board itself, right? GameFi, same thing. And so for that matter, like we thought a lot about initial products and how they can leverage like layer N. We are first also starting off with DEXs, like where we can actually bootstrap initial volume, initial activity, get users on board, get initial traction so people can actually actively build on top of us and use the products aggressively. And from there on, like our thinking process when bringing more teams to the board was not like, hey, can you join us and build on us and we will move on to the next target, but more like, hey, I know you're building this cool product or you have this cool idea and here's how it can work within the ecosystem. And I think I mentioned a couple of interesting ideas, which included structured products, it included market making rollups, AI trading agents, and all of these aspects like who can leverage existing DEXs to build their own products and essentially creating a really strong flywheel effect of things where like this product launched and this product launched, and then it like brings volume to each other, it brings more activity, users get to use more applications, et cetera, et cetera. And we continue to think through other ideas and have like a lot of other folks as well joining, like to bring some ideas that we even haven't thought of before. And that's like what exciting. And I think like that's like feels like it's a better way of building an ecosystem instead of like just going through a checklist. I need to lending, I need a DEX, I need 10 swaps, protocols, whatnot, and trying to be more strategic around that. And how can it actually build into like a really integrated space where like people who come build on top of us, like actually realize that they can leverage a lot of other protocols to build their ideal vision, right?
Exciting. My customary closing question is to get people to look out to the future because I always get excited about what's coming next. Obviously, you've got the mainnet launch coming up, but beyond that, what should we be on the lookout for from Layer N this year?
Yeah, I think mainnet launch coming up. I would recommend to just like join Discord, join our community. I think like that's what we started to target more and more, building not just like the tech, because that's obviously exciting, but I think like only makes sense when there is a social consensus around it, which is something ineffable, like hard to describe, but that's what makes it all work. That's what brings the security and users as well. And if you want to be a part of it, like just come along and join also like communities of like the projects that are building on top of us, like who've been announced so far. And we're just really excited to what's to come and really want to get more people on board as well.
Fantastic. Dima, thanks so much. It's been really exciting to learn more about Layer N today.
No, it's been a pleasure, Ian. Thank you for having me.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to another episode. If you enjoyed what you heard today, do me a favor. Open up your podcast app, rate the show. Give us a review. Tell us what you liked. Even better, you can share the podcast with your friends. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Earlier this year, we reported that approximately $2.7 billion has been lost to approval phishing, demonstrating that this type of scam is much bigger than previously known. And that is why I'm proud to announce Chainalysis' participation in Operation Spincaster, a public-private collaboration designed to disrupt and prevent scams. Leveraging the transparency of the blockchain, Chainalysis was able to proactively identify thousands of compromised wallets. This actionable intelligence enabled 12 public sector agencies and 17 crypto exchanges across 6 countries to come together to support victims and pursue the scammers. To find out more, check out our blog, which is linked in the show notes.